My name is Darius Bennett. There are moments in life when everything changes so quietly that you don't realize your entire future has already been rewritten. For me, that moment started on a Friday evening, the kind of Friday that felt completely forgettable. That Friday evening, I stopped at the same gas station we had visited for years. The cashier recognized me immediately. He greeted me by name before I even reached the counter. I grabbed a coffee from the heated shelf, picked up a sandwich, paid for fuel, then walked toward the lottery machine. That had become a small tradition in our marriage. Every Friday, one of us bought lottery tickets. Not because we expected to win, but because we enjoyed imagining impossible possibilities. Sometimes we talked about buying a beach house. Sometimes we joked about quitting our jobs. Other times we talked about helping our parents retire. The conversations were always entertaining. The tickets almost never mattered. That evening I purchased several tickets, folded them carefully, placed them in my wallet, and thought absolutely nothing about it. If someone had told me that those pieces of paper would eventually destroy my marriage, lead to lawyers, lead to investigations, and ultimately change both our lives forever, I would have laughed. Because sometimes the biggest events in life arrive disguised as ordinary moments. When I arrived home, my wife was sitting on the couch watching television. She smiled when I walked through the door. I kissed her forehead, placed the tickets inside a kitchen drawer, and joined her. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt different. Nothing warned me about what was coming. A few days later, I left for a business trip. The trip was supposed to last less than a week. Several meetings, several presentations, then home again. The schedule was exhausting. Most mornings started before sunrise. Most evenings ended long after dark. By the second day, I was already counting the hours until I could return home. That was when my wife called. At first, the conversation felt normal. She asked how the trip was going, asked whether I was eating properly, asked when I would be home. Then she surprised me. She sounded happier than I had heard her in months. Her energy practically exploded through the phone. I remember smiling while listening to her. Whatever had put her in such a good mood clearly made her happy. And hearing her laugh made me happy too. The next day she called again. Then again later that evening. Then again the following morning. At first I enjoyed the attention. After years of marriage, couples often stop calling each other multiple times every day. It felt refreshing. Almost romantic. But after several days something started feeling strange. Not wrong. Just unusual. Every conversation seemed focused on the future. Not next week. Not next month. The future. She kept asking what I would do if our lives changed overnight. She asked where I would want to live, what kind of house I would buy, what kind of car I would drive, whether I would keep working. I assumed she was simply daydreaming. After all, we had joked about those subjects for years. Still, something about the intensity felt different. The questions kept coming. What if we suddenly had unlimited money? What if we never had to worry about bills again? What if everything changed tomorrow? I laughed and answered her questions. But deep down I couldn't understand why she suddenly seemed obsessed with those ideas. A few days later, my trip finally ended. The moment my plane landed, she called asking when I would arrive home. When I pulled into the driveway, she was already waiting outside. Before I could even exit the car, she ran toward me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me. For a moment, I felt like we were newlyweds again. Her excitement was impossible to ignore. Throughout dinner, she barely stopped talking. She seemed energized, hopeful, almost euphoric. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen her so happy. Part of me wondered whether something amazing had happened while I was away, but every time I asked, she simply smiled, then changed the subject. Over the next week, her behavior became even more unusual. She spent more time on her phone, more time researching things online, more time locked inside her home office. Whenever I entered the room, she quickly minimized whatever was on her screen. The first few times I ignored it. Everyone deserves privacy. But eventually curiosity started creeping in. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and noticed several pages spread across the table. The moment she saw me, she gathered them immediately. Her reaction happened so fast it felt rehearsed. I asked what she was working on. She smiled, said it was nothing important, and changed the subject. That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me even more curious. Over the following days, I noticed other changes. She started receiving calls from unknown numbers. Whenever those calls arrived, she left the room. Sometimes she stepped outside. Sometimes she locked herself in another part of the house. When I asked who kept calling, she always had an answer. A friend, a survey company, someone selling insurance. The explanations sounded reasonable, yet somehow none of them felt true. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning and discovered her side of the bed was empty. I walked downstairs. The house was dark, but a light glowed beneath the door of her office. I knocked gently. Several seconds passed before she answered. When she finally opened the door, she looked startled, almost nervous. The expression vanished quickly, but not quickly enough. I saw it. I asked whether everything was okay. She assured me it was. Then she closed the door again. I stood there staring at the hallway, wondering why the woman I loved suddenly felt like a stranger. The next morning she acted completely normal, as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't been working behind a locked door in the middle of the night. Days continued passing, and with every passing day my confusion grew. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't openly distant. In fact, sometimes she seemed more affectionate than ever. Yet something invisible had changed. Something I couldn't identify. And that uncertainty became impossible to ignore. Then one evening during dinner she asked a question that stopped me cold. She casually asked who legally owns a lottery ticket if more than one person is involved. I laughed, assuming she had seen something online, but she didn't laugh back. Instead she waited, watching me carefully, almost studying my response. For the first time a feeling of unease settled deep inside my chest, because suddenly all those strange conversations, all those secret phone calls, all those questions about money and the future, started feeling connected. I just couldn't figure out how. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly know, was that the answer to every question was already sitting quietly inside our house, hidden in a place I hadn't checked in weeks. And before long that answer would tear my entire life apart. For the next several days I couldn't stop thinking about that question. Who legally owns a lottery ticket if more than one person is involved? The words kept replaying in my head, not because the question itself was unusual, but because of the way my wife had asked it. There had been something calculated behind it, something deliberate, almost as if she already knew the answer she wanted, and was simply checking whether I knew it too. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Still, I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. Marriage requires trust, and after 8 years together, I didn't want to become the kind of husband who turned every strange moment into a conspiracy. So I ignored the feeling, at least for a while. Unfortunately, the feeling refused to disappear. Every day brought another small detail, another strange behavior, another unanswered question. One evening I arrived home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. My wife wasn't in the living room. She wasn't in the kitchen. Then I heard voices coming from her office. At first I assumed she was speaking with a friend, but as I approached the door, I realized something was different. The conversation sounded formal, professional. I couldn't hear every word. Only fragments. Assets. Ownership. Documentation. Verification. My stomach tightened. The moment she heard my footsteps, the conversation ended. Seconds later, the office door opened. She smiled, asked why I was home early, and acted as if nothing unusual had happened. I wanted to ask questions. Instead, I said nothing. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I began noticing things I had previously ignored. Receipts hidden inside drawers. Documents quickly folded whenever I entered a room. Emails instantly closed when I walked past her laptop. Individually, none of those things meant much. Together they painted a picture I didn't understand. A picture that seemed to be growing more concerning every day. Then another strange change appeared. My wife started spending money. Not enormous amounts. At least not initially, but enough to attract attention. Designer clothes began appearing. Jewelry arrived in packages. Luxury handbags showed up without explanation. When I asked about them, she claimed they were gifts. When I asked from whom, she changed the subject. The answers never made sense. But whenever I pressed for details, she became defensive. Before long, our conversations started turning into arguments. Not explosive arguments. The quiet kind. The kind that leave two people sitting across from each other pretending everything is normal while knowing it isn't. The distance between us continued growing. One evening, I found her staring at photographs of waterfront mansions online. The homes looked like resorts, private docks, infinity pools, views worth millions. She didn't notice me standing behind her. For several moments, I simply watched. Eventually, she realized I was there. Instead of appearing embarrassed, she smiled. Then she asked a question. If you could start your life over completely, would you? The question caught me off guard. I told her I didn't want to start over. I liked my life. I liked our life. For some reason, that answer seemed to disappoint her. She looked away and said nothing else. That conversation stayed with me for days, because it felt like she wasn't talking about a dream. It felt like she was describing a plan. Then came the moment everything finally started making sense. I arrived home one afternoon and found a folder sitting on the dining room table. The moment I saw the words printed across the front, my heart nearly stopped. Divorce consultation. For several seconds, I simply stared, certain I had misunderstood what I was seeing. Then my wife walked into the room. The expression on her face told me everything. There would be no explanation, no misunderstanding, no harmless excuse. The truth was standing directly in front of me. I asked her what was going on. She remained calm, far calmer than I was. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Then she told me we needed to talk. Those 4 words changed my life forever. I sat across from her, my pulse pounding, my mind racing. Part of me still believed there had to be another explanation. There wasn't. She informed me she had been speaking with attorneys for weeks. She said she had spent months evaluating her future. She said she no longer believed our marriage was what she wanted. Every sentence felt like a punch to the chest. I asked whether there was someone else. She said no. I asked whether I had done something wrong. She said no. I asked why this was happening, and finally she gave an answer I will never forget. Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life tied to someone I no longer need. The room went silent. At first, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. No longer need. Those were the words she used. Need. As if our marriage had been a business arrangement. As if our relationship existed only because it served a purpose. I stared at her in disbelief. The woman sitting across from me looked familiar, yet somehow she felt like a complete stranger. Then she finally revealed what all of this had been about. The lottery ticket. The winning ticket. The one worth $100 million. She admitted she had known for weeks. Weeks. While I had been trying to understand her behavior, trying to save our marriage, trying to figure out what was wrong, she had already known about the jackpot. And she had already been planning her exit. The realization hit me like a truck. I couldn't even process it. The woman I loved hadn't celebrated the win with me. She hadn't planned a future with me. Instead, she had spent weeks planning a future without me. A future financed by money she believed belonged entirely to her. The following days became a nightmare. Attorneys appeared. Documents appeared. Financial advisors appeared. Everyone seemed to be orbiting around the jackpot. Friends who hadn't called in years suddenly reappeared. Relatives started visiting. People treated her differently, almost like royalty. And the attention changed her even more. Every conversation revolved around money. Every decision revolved around money. Every plan revolved around money. Meanwhile, I felt like I was disappearing from my own life. Then came the public announcement. The moment she officially revealed the jackpot, news spread quickly, faster than I could have imagined. Within hours, everyone knew. Co-workers, neighbors, friends, family members, complete strangers. And with that attention came something even worse. Assumptions. Most people immediately accepted her version of events. Most people assumed the ticket belonged exclusively to her. Most people assumed I was simply an ex-husband trying to benefit from her success. Some even said it directly to my face. The betrayal hurt. But the humiliation hurt even more. Then one morning an envelope arrived. I already knew what it contained before opening it. Official divorce papers. I sat alone staring at the documents for several minutes, unable to move, unable to think, unable to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. Just months earlier, we had been discussing vacation plans. Now attorneys were preparing to divide our lives apart. Yet as devastating as that moment felt, I had no idea something even bigger was coming. Because hidden beneath all the chaos, buried beneath the greed, the lawyers, the money, and the betrayal, a truth existed that neither my wife nor I fully understood. A truth that would eventually change everything. And when that truth finally surfaced, the fight over $100 million would become something far bigger than a divorce. The morning after receiving the divorce papers, I sat alone in my attorney's office wondering how my life had fallen apart so quickly. The previous few months felt unreal. Every time I tried making sense of what had happened, I ended up with more questions than answers. My wife had known about the jackpot for weeks, maybe longer. She had spoken with lawyers, financial advisors, consultants, and somehow managed to hide all of it while smiling across the dinner table. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. Across from me sat my attorney, a quiet man named Grant Holloway. Unlike most lawyers, he rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. For nearly an hour he reviewed documents without interruption, occasionally making notes, occasionally highlighting sections. Eventually he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and asked a question nobody else had asked. Who actually bought the ticket? At first I almost laughed. The answer felt obvious. I bought lottery tickets all the time. My wife bought them too. For years it had been a shared tradition. Trying to remember one specific purchase felt impossible. Grant nodded thoughtfully, then asked another question. Do you remember the day the winning ticket was purchased? That question stopped me, because suddenly fragments of memory started returning. The gas station, the coffee, the sandwich, the fuel, the lottery machine, the business trip. I remembered buying several tickets before leaving town. I remembered placing them inside the kitchen drawer, and I remembered leaving for the airport shortly afterward. Grant noticed my expression changing. Tell me everything you remember. For the next 30 minutes I described every detail I could recall. When I finished, he sat quietly for several moments. Then he said something unexpected. I think we should verify everything. At the time I didn't understand why. After all, the jackpot itself wasn't being questioned. Everyone agreed the ticket had won. The dispute centered around ownership. Still, Grant insisted. He wanted receipts, transaction records, store information, anything connected to the purchase. The investigation began the following week. At first, nothing seemed unusual. We obtained bank statements, reviewed transaction histories, collected records. Most of it looked routine. Then one afternoon Grant called and asked me to come to his office immediately. The moment I entered, I knew something had changed. Several documents were spread across his desk. For the first time since I had hired him, he looked genuinely excited. He pointed toward one specific transaction. There. I leaned closer. The charge looked ordinary. A purchase at the gas station. Coffee, food, fuel, lottery tickets. The date immediately caught my attention. It matched the exact day I had remembered. Grant tapped the paper again. This purchase came from your card. For several seconds I simply stared. Technically that wasn't shocking. I had already suspected I purchased the tickets. But Grant wasn't finished. He slid another document toward me. Store loyalty records. The account number matched mine. The transaction matched mine. The purchase matched mine. Every record pointed toward the same conclusion. I had bought the ticket. My heartbeat accelerated. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something changing. Not hope. Not yet. But possibility. Grant continued digging. Over the following days, additional evidence appeared. Store surveillance footage had been archived. The quality wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed me standing at the counter on the day of purchase. The timestamp matched. The transaction matched. Everything matched. For weeks, my wife had been acting as though ownership was obvious. Suddenly, it didn't look obvious anymore. The more evidence we uncovered, the more complicated her story became. Then another discovery appeared. And this one was even bigger. Lottery registration records. Grant stared at those records for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. When he finally looked up, his expression had completely changed. Darius, I need you to answer something very carefully. Did you ever create an online lottery account? I nodded. Years earlier, mostly out of curiosity. Occasionally I scanned tickets through the app. Occasionally I checked results. Nothing unusual. Grant slowly turned his computer screen toward me. What appeared next made my stomach drop. There on the screen sat information connected directly to the winning ticket. The ticket had been linked to my account. Not after the jackpot announcement. Not after the divorce. Not after lawyers became involved. Before any of that, the registration timestamp proved it. The connection existed before anyone knew the ticket was worth a fortune. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, because we both understood the significance immediately. Ownership wasn't becoming weaker. Ownership was becoming stronger, far stronger, and every new piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Word of the investigation eventually reached my wife's legal team. The reaction was immediate. Suddenly, attorneys who had once seemed confident started requesting delays, additional reviews, additional documentation, additional time. Grant recognized what was happening. They were worried. For the first time since the divorce began, they were worried. Weeks passed. More evidence arrived. More records were verified. More witnesses were identified. The foundation supporting my wife's claim was beginning to crack. Meanwhile, the media continued portraying her as the lucky winner, the future millionaire, the woman preparing for a glamorous new life. Nobody knew what was happening behind the scenes. Nobody knew the case was changing. Nobody knew a storm was coming. Then one morning, Grant received confirmation that changed everything. The judge had reviewed preliminary findings and decided the ownership dispute required a formal hearing. Not later. Not eventually. Immediately. The case was moving to court. For the first time, my wife would have to answer questions. For the first time, evidence would be examined publicly. For the first time, assumptions would no longer matter. Facts would. Several weeks later, I walked toward the courthouse entrance. Reporters crowded the sidewalk. Camera crews filled the area. People whispered as we passed. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt electric. Everyone expected a routine divorce hearing involving a lottery winner. Very few understood what was actually about to happen. When my ex-wife arrived, she looked completely confident. She wore designer clothing, diamond jewelry, and the same expression she had worn ever since discovering the jackpot. Victory. She still believed this story had already been written. She still believed the ending belonged to her. Inside the courtroom, spectators filled every available seat. Attorneys organized documents. Court staff moved quietly between tables. Then the judge entered. The room immediately fell silent. My ex-wife sat beside her attorney, calm, relaxed, smiling. The judge reviewed several files, adjusted his glasses, then looked directly toward both legal teams. The first ownership questions began. Who purchased the ticket? Who possessed the ticket? Who registered the ticket? Who could prove it? The courtroom became completely silent. Then the judge leaned forward, looked directly toward both attorneys, and asked a single question. Can either side prove who actually purchased the winning ticket? The entire room froze, because everyone suddenly realized this case was no longer about a divorce. It was about $100 million. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire courtroom seemed frozen in place. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Can either side prove who actually purchased the winning ticket? My ex-wife's attorney stood first. He spoke confidently, at least at the beginning. He argued that possession indicated ownership. He argued that my ex-wife had checked the numbers. He argued that she had claimed the prize. He argued that she had become publicly recognized as the winner. The judge listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, occasionally asking questions. Then my attorney stood, and everything changed. One document at a time. One piece of evidence at a time. The entire story started falling apart. First came the bank records. The purchase had been made using my card. Then came the loyalty account information. The transaction was connected to my membership number. Then came the surveillance footage. The video clearly showed me standing at the counter purchasing the tickets. The judge watched every second. The courtroom remained silent. Then came the lottery registration records. That was the moment I saw panic appear in my ex-wife's eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked afraid. The records showed that the winning ticket had been linked to my lottery account before the jackpot announcement, before the divorce, before the lawyers, before the media attention. The evidence was undeniable. The more my attorney spoke, the smaller my ex-wife seemed to become. Her confidence disappeared. Her smile vanished. Her attorney stopped making eye contact. The spectators who had once whispered about my defeat now sat in complete silence. The judge spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the evidence. The room felt unbearably tense. Finally, he removed his glasses, looked directly at both sides, and began delivering his decision. Every heartbeat felt louder than the last. The judge explained that ownership was determined by evidence, not assumptions, not publicity, not public perception. Evidence. The evidence clearly established who purchased the ticket. The evidence clearly established who registered the ticket. The evidence clearly established legal ownership. Then came the words that changed everything. The winning ticket belongs to Mr. Bennett. A gasp spread across the courtroom. Several people covered their mouths. Others stared in disbelief. My ex-wife looked completely stunned, as though she could not understand what she had just heard. The judge continued speaking, but honestly I barely heard the rest. After months of accusations, months of humiliation, months of watching people assume the worst about me, the truth had finally won. $100 million. Legally mine. My ex-wife suddenly stood, attempting to argue, attempting to protest, attempting to explain. The judge immediately stopped her. The ruling had been made. The case was over. Nothing she said could change the facts. For several moments she simply stood there, speechless. Then she slowly sat back down, defeated. When the hearing ended, people avoided looking at me. The same relatives who had celebrated her victory walked past in silence. The same friends who had mocked me suddenly had nothing to say. I left the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because of the money, because the truth had finally been exposed. The following years transformed my life. I invested carefully, built several successful businesses, created jobs, supported local charities, and helped people who needed opportunities. The money gave me freedom, but it was wisdom that helped me keep it. Most importantly, I found love again, real love. The kind that isn't measured by wealth. The kind that remains when nobody is watching. 3 years later, I married an incredible woman named Olivia. She was kind, loyal, and completely different from my ex-wife. Together, we built a peaceful life, a beautiful home, and a family filled with happiness. For the first time in years, I felt truly complete. Then one afternoon, the past unexpectedly returned. I was sitting in my home office when I heard the doorbell ring. A few moments later, Olivia answered. Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. My ex-wife. Curious. I walked toward the entrance. Before I reached the door, I heard Olivia speaking firmly. You need to leave. My ex-wife tried explaining. She claimed she only wanted a few minutes. She said she wanted to apologize. Olivia didn't move. She simply repeated herself. Leave. When I finally reached the doorway, my ex-wife looked completely different. Older, tired, defeated. Gone was the woman who once believed $100 million made her untouchable. Tears filled her eyes. She apologized for everything. For the lies. For the greed. For destroying our marriage. For believing money mattered more than loyalty. I listened quietly, then thanked her for the apology. I told her I genuinely hoped she found peace. But the past was over. The life she walked away from no longer existed. Olivia stepped beside me and gently took my hand. My ex-wife noticed immediately, and in that moment she finally understood what she had truly lost. Not the money, not the mansion, not the businesses. Me. A few moments later she turned around and walked away alone. I closed the door, looked at my wife, and smiled. Because sometimes the greatest lottery prize isn't the money you win. It's discovering who truly deserves a place in your future. Significant and educational value. This story teaches a powerful truth about character, trust, and greed. Money does not change who people are. It reveals who they have always been. The wife believed wealth would guarantee happiness and freedom, but her greed destroyed the very relationship that helped build her future. The husband succeeded not because he won the lottery, but because he remained patient, honest, and dignified when facing betrayal. Real success is not measured by money alone. It is measured by integrity, loyalty, wisdom, and the people who choose to stand beside you when circumstances change. Finally, the story teaches that real success is not measured by a